Welcome back. In this video, we're going to discuss an important concept in object-oriented programming, in which we pass methods and properties from one class to another. This is known as inheritance. Even though JavaScript is not an object-oriented language, we can mimic inheritance with objects and functions just like we do with our constructor functions. Remember, inheritance is the process of passing methods and properties from one class to another. In JavaScript, we do not have classes built into the language. So what exactly do we pass from one constructor function to another? When doing inheritance with JavaScript, we don't actually pass one constructor to another. We pass the prototype property of one constructor to another constructor. The idea here is that since the prototype property is where all of our properties and methods live, we need to have another constructor function get all those properties. You might be wondering why we do this, so let's take a look at a small example. Here we have two constructor functions, person and student, and we can see that our constructor function is using apply to reduce duplication. But the student.prototype object has a method called sayHi, which looks just like the method we implemented on the person prototype. Is there any way we can copy over that function? The first idea that might come to mind is, let's assign the prototype property of one object to be another's. So we can assign student.prototype to be person.prototype. Now we can create an object from the student constructor and invoke the sayHi method, and it works. Well, not exactly. Let's add something onto the student.prototype object. If we implemented this correctly, our person objects should not be able to be modified from the student constructor function. Remember, we want a student to inherit from person. So if we did this correctly, the inheritance should only affect the student. Now let's create a new object from the person constructor and see if it has a status method, which it should not. Status is just something that belongs to the student prototype. Something isn't right here. The person prototype should not have properties from the student prototype. The problem here is that we can't just assign one object to another. It will just create a reference. Let's see what we mean by that with a simple example if you're confused. I'm going to create an object called O and give it a name property and a value of Ellie. I'll then create another object, O2, and assign it to O. If I change the name property on O2 to Tim, and then examine the name property on O, it has also been changed as well. That's because when we assign one object to another, we do not create a brand new object. We just create a reference or a link to an existing object. In our case, this means that if we change the student prototype, it will also affect the person prototype. We still want all of the methods and properties from the person prototype, but we do not want a reference. So how can we fix this? The answer is object.create, a function that creates a brand new object and accepts as its first parameter what the dunder proto should be for that newly created object. This is exactly what we need. Let's see how it works. We can see here that our student prototype is being assigned to a new object with a dunder proto of person.prototype. Now let's add a function on the student prototype to see if it does not affect the person prototype. And then let's create a person object, and we can see that the student prototype does not affect the person prototype anymore. Now you might be wondering, why are we using object.create and not the new keyword? Since the new keyword sets what the prototype object should be. Although it does the same thing as object.create, it will add unnecessary properties on the prototype object. So when doing inheritance through the prototype, which is commonly called prototypal inheritance, use object.create. Now that we have passed along methods and properties from one prototype object to another, there is one final piece to completing inheritance. Remember that every prototype object has a property on it called constructor, which points back to the constructor function. If we take a look at the constructor property on student.prototype, we will actually see that it is the person constructor. That's because when we did object.create, we overwrote the constructor property. So we need to make sure to set it back to the correct value. We call this resetting the constructor, and it is the final part of prototypal inheritance. To do that, we simply assign student.prototype.constructor to be the student function. To recap, there are two parts to prototypal inheritance: setting the prototype property to be a newly created object, and resetting the constructor property. This concept is a bit tricky to wrap your head around, so if you're still not feeling too confident, Try these examples in the Chrome console to see exactly how everything is happening. In the next video, we'll review what we've learned in this section. But first, it's time for you to practice with inheritance. Good luck.